So, welcome everyone. Thanks to the Peel Harvey Catchment Council for sponsoring this or organising this with the sponsorship of the West Australian Government's Natural Resource Management Program, and wherever all that came from, you and some holes in the ground, I suppose. So thanks to all of that. In framing this particular presentation, I thought of it in several ways, and I just kept coming back to our platform. I came back to as well some of our resources that I'd already done. So following a fire in 2015 that occurred in South Australia, actually, and some of the work that one of my clients in Michelle Lally had done. Michelle has had a farm called the Savannah Farm in the Clare Valley in South Australia, and there was a big fire that went through the Adelaide Hills, and following that, Michelle, who wasn't affected, did a lot of organisation around getting a lot of those farmers feed, because it's one of the first things, as you know, that gets taken out is feed. So anyway, I felt that it was a good opportunity to write one of my off the contour blog posts, and in order to sort of respond to the situation, as I called it, after the fire, which was where I first used that term, and within the framework of the Regrarians platform, I provided a range of, let's just say, discussion points for what people might do after a fire. So that was the sort of first touchstone to using the platform in that kind of way. And reading through that, this actually was a pretty reasonable checklist for me to run through, and it enabled me also to go back and look at a couple of references that I'd forgotten about or hadn't looked at since. So that was really awesome. I also, including Rod Masons, I couldn't bloody remember this guy's name, an Aboriginal cultural fire management person in the southeast of New South Wales, in probably country that is not that dissimilar to some of the more humid areas of the southwest of Western Australia as well. Obviously, all these areas are different, but there's a lot of similarities at the same time. And so it was really good to touch in on what Rod and others had done, because so much of the discussion around Indigenous fire management actually comes from the north of Australia, which is summer rainfall and very, very different landscapes and very different plant communities, etc. So just completely different conditions. Whereas in the southern zones of our country, where, let's just say, colonisation was more powerful as an event, not as much of a connection necessarily with cultural fire and land management practices as there has been in the north of the country. So yeah, there's those factors as well. So that was good to connect in with that again. The other key resource that I took some time to have a look at was was the Regrarians Handbook itself. I suppose when we look at the role or where we sort of categorise fire, so if you look at the Regrarians platform as being something of an organising framework or a cataloguing framework, where does fire go? Well, fire goes in every layer, and that's proven by what I just went through there on our blog. But then when we came to writing this quite long section in the handbook, and where that should best go, well, most people connect fire and water together. Of course, it's not the only layer that it's connected to, but it's one of the strongest ones. So I used that again. I used when it came down to the application of the platform, I used the climate Regrarians platform to guide some of this. So you'll see some words from here and broader parameters put into this presentation as well. So yeah, have a look at that. That's one of the references that I have among many for this particular discussion. All right, well, that's plenty on that. So if you do have any questions, please just pop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and it's always a bit funny when I don't know what it is, when you use Keynote and Zoom together. I don't have quite the flexibility, so best if you've got a question to just pop it, or you want to have a quick chat by voice. Then just let me know and we'll put you on, because as you know, we can do that. So just put it in the chat or the Q&A. All right, well, let's hit it. So thanks again to all of those involved. This book is recently released as part of a series of First Knowledges, which are edited by Margot Neal, whose son Sonny is a close personal friend. He's actually over in WA at the moment. He's moved over there last year with his family. His wife Deb took up a teaching post over there. Anyway, this is the third book in this series, and the first one was around songlines, the second one was around design, and this third one, which was written by Bill Gammage and Bruce Pascoe, both well-known writers in this space. Bill, a non-Aboriginal historian of note, and Bruce Pascoe, who's a novelist and perhaps best known for his book Dark Emu, and all of the, some probably a controversial book for some, but one that opened a whole range of different thinking and appreciations about this continent and its Aboriginal management. And so I thought that it was interesting to get from Margot O'Neill's introduction to this book, a stanza that she put in there about fire, that fire was a friend, not an enemy, that we, as in Aboriginal people, did not fear fire or use it to reduce fuel load like the newcomers do. We had no fuel overload because of our good land management. The country was shaped with fire by anyone on a regular basis and where necessary. And today we have specialised firefighters, but in 1788 and before, everyone was a fire specialist. No corner of this continent was uncared for. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty or have some debate about particularly the last comment there, that no corner of this continent was uncared for. We weren't there, or most of us, unless you're an Indigenous Australian with a continuous connection, we don't know. But when we look at a lot of the records that first contact Europeans had, it's not too far off the truth, and all of that is becoming more and more obvious. Another book that Alan Savory, I've been in conversation with him quite a lot lately, as he challenges me to, on a whole range of different levels, as to my motivations as a human and so on, in a nice way, in a fatherly way, as he says he's in the departure lounge and he wants to help me out because I'm not. Anyway, Alan said to me the other day in a private meeting, he said, "Have you read Reconciling Man and the Environment?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And he said, "Well, you must." So I got it, and by Lord Ashby. And I thought that this was a really cool thing on the back cover, on the dust cover of this book. This book was written in 1978, and this is, in the past I've used quotes from people like Jared Diamond and others, which have said, if we're not prepared, then we're prepared for failure and all that sort of stuff, which we but this is a lot deeper. That I believe that man's attitude to nature in Western societies has been changing almost imperceptibly over the last 100 years, and that it is the change, and that the change is for the better. I do not underestimate the perils threatening industrial society, though I think that some of the people who warn us about environmental crises have got their perspectives wrong. Indeed, I think they are wrong to call it a crisis at all. A crisis is a situation that will pass. It can be resolved by temporary hardship, temporary adjustment, technological and political expedience. What we are experiencing is not a crisis, it is a climacteric. I think that's how you say that. For the rest of man's history on Earth, so far as one can foretell, he will have to live with problems of population, of resources, of pollution. And the seminal problem remains unsolved. Can man adapt himself to anticipate environmental constraints? Or will he, like other animal societies, adapt himself only in response to the constraints after they have begun to hurt? In one facet of this problem, I see reason for cautious optimism. This is what these lectures are about. And I can't find anything wrong with that statement. And I think that when we look at where we are right now, as a society, as a global community of people, this is as true a statement as one would get. And when we zoom back into the parts of Western Australia where you are all living, and the day to day, and the summer that you've just had, and the winter that you just had, and all of that irregularity, and the threats, and as we've been talking about lately at Regrarians, the trauma of the perception of trauma, of the threat of trauma, because some of you have had trauma. Well, most people have had some trauma, or if not all. But the degree of trauma that some people have had has actually been incredible, whether that's been from a fire or other incidents. So we're living in that sort of space, and I think that we've got to a point now where we're really going to have to take, people say, oh, we're going to have to take a serious look at things. I think we really have to take a serious look at things. It's sort of getting to that point, because Europeans have had control of this I say planet, because we have everything the world does ostensibly now is of a European nature. Yes, there's some influences from other parts of the world, but largely everyone behaves like a European. And there's peculiarities that come with the European psyche, as there are with every other peoples around the world. So we've had our crack at this continent for a couple of 100 years, and it's not shaping up too well as a report card. So when we look at what we've got to do, can and will we adapt? I think there's some serious questions, and it's not going to happen very quickly. It's going to involve a conversation and a true a makarata with ourselves, with Aboriginal people on this continent and others, before we can get to some sort of reconciliation about how we're actually going to live here. I've often questioned how this continent's status would be if the Spanish had conquered it, or if the Portuguese had a people from dry lands, not people from humid landscapes, how that would have fared. Going to those places, probably not that great, because those parts of the world are not faring that well either. But they did have a respect for vegetation, which is quite, and an understanding of vegetation management, which is quite different to those of Northern Europe. So when we get to this, going through the way I'm going to frame this presentation is that each of the headings, each of the layers, I'm going to preface with some sort of a checklist. So with the climate layer, I'm starting with that we need a psychological preparedness and holistic context. I'll expand on each of these. We need to understand our legislation, so the climate of regulation, the climate of ourselves, and the meteorological climate, weather conditions, and climate history, and so on. We also need to, as I've just put it, increase our knowledge about our country, but also its ecosystems and its capacity and our own capacities. So when it comes to that, one of the things that we had in the handbook was this kind of assessment where we looked at a land and land manager assessment. So looking at our own education and knowledge about fire and its relationship with land management. And I would go further than that. I think that there's this narrative that fire is all about a land management thing. It's not just, nothing is ever just about one thing. It's always got to be viewed through a holistic lens, I believe. So we start with understanding that yes, it is a land management issue, but it's also a social issue, and it's also a financial issue. And it's also a cultural issue. So if we look at those four main domains of human interaction in the world, then that's how. And if we look at that through the paradigm of holism, then we're on the right track. So that psychological preparedness and that holistic context that should address those. Legal development allowances, looking at all of our building codes and control plans, all of the climate factors, sector analysis that we've discussed in the RECs, that's from permaculture and landscape architecture, the fuel loads that we have, and historical and looking at historical fire events and their patterns. When it comes to geography, looking at topography, the aspect of our properties, the slopes, etc. And then demographics and proximity, and a Bell assessment, something that you can all do. It's a relatively straightforward process. And we'll talk more about that. Water resources, what you have is a starting point, which again we address in the RECs, but looking at, what mains water do we have and its reliability, dams, wetlands, tanks, pumps, fire hydrants, sprinklers, all of the rest of it. And then, do we have all the standards fire service fittings? What are the standard fire service fittings for your area, for your state, for your brigade? They may be different. Don't just take my word for it. Access to firefighting equipment, people, services, water storages, evacuation routes, communication, what vegetation types you have, communities that there are, how flammable are they at different times in their life cycle or throughout, and the risks to these. Livestock safe places, built that are useful to have, buildings, houses, workshops, barns, garages, livestock, animal sheds, fire shelters, fencing, all of the material suitability that you've got to look at, and risk of placement, gate sizes, and so on. And then soils. What are we doing about them before? Because a large part of what we do in terms of soil management or ecosystem management has a lot to do with how a fire might go, and how that'll impact adjoining landholders, what budget you have, and the sources of power, electricity and gas, and location of power lines, and so on. So one of the frameworks, I found this bloke years ago called Kevin Long. He has a website called The Long View. It's he's like a lot of long-range weather forecasters. He kind of has an almost entertaining view on life because it's based on geological timeframes in many cases. But notwithstanding, I've found this, which was a study of my hometown of Bendigo in central Victoria, as being a really interesting way of being able to ascertain the trends within the trends. Most people look at rainfall and its impact on our environment by looking at what are the average. So you meet someone, you often will say, "What's your average rainfall in this space?" But what does the actual average mean? And are there any trends within? And that's where I think it's useful, and we're very fortunate. We're uniquely fortunate in Australia to have the Bureau of Meteorology and its incredible network of both official and unofficial public providers of data to this service, and then the accessibility of the records, which can go back well over a century, is just it's unparalleled in the world, quite frankly, because I look all the time. So we're really fortunate to be able to have that kind of understanding. Now, one of the things that I've talked about in the Rex over time and before in Western Australia is that there is a discussion about a declining average of rainfall. So if that's the case, then what is it? I haven't seen, and admittedly, I haven't put a project over there through this process of analysis. Furthermore, what I've found when I've been in Western Australia and other parts of the world is this declining volume of water. So declining in overall intensity of rainfall. We could say that 2021, by the sounds of it, was anomalous. Very high levels of rainfall, and particularly followed by an extremely or record-breaking hot summer. Anomalies all over the place. So it's helpful for us to go through these kinds of processes to try and understand if there are any patterns within within all of this chaos, because it kind of is helpful. Where in the latest Rex, we've got quite a few Western Australians who've come on, and we've been looking at the usual thing of people want to build dams, and we want to know what the runoff coefficients are going to be, and all that fun stuff. And looking at some of the trend lines and talking to people and having people analyse that. Yeah, last year was one out of the box, but before that, some of the rainfall figures were alarming, and so that then feeds into our concern about where are we going to get the water from, because especially in Western Australia, because of your geography, where you are, and the southwest of Western Australia in particular, and then the land use that's gone on, and then its impact on groundwater hydrology. It means that you are predominantly a surface water storage people, and so I think it's really interesting. Thanks. So there's a couple of points there, so we'll just reserve those in the chat. Thank you to Kim, and before that, I couldn't see who that was. I can't scroll at the moment, sorry. So in terms of planning tools, one of the biggest concerns that people and planners are going to have will be around buildings and built infrastructure. And as a result of the fires in Victoria in 2009, which were so very devastating, that resulted in a Royal Commission in Victoria, and then it resulted in a whole range of other states sort of following suit. One of the things that happened from that was the first of these Australian standards, which was released later in that year. It was 3959:2009, and that's where the BAL assessment, the bushfire attack level assessment, was introduced. Now, it hasn't really changed that much, and I do know that there's some people on this, I know that I won't name names, but one person who did the Rex in the last Rex with us shared with me a BAL assessment that they'd had completed professionally, and it was a really thorough job and all of that. But also, please understand that BEL assessments can, as far as I know, they may not be in your state, but as far as I know, can actually be produced by individuals. And I've done quite a few of them over my journey, and I've not found them to be particularly confronting. Why would I suggest such a thing? Well, I think that even if you're not building, I think a BEL assessment is a really, really good place to start, to just start the checklist, to just have a check-in on how the structures, the most valuable assets that you have in your life, outside of yourselves, how they interact with the environment around them when it comes to fire. So even if you're not required to do a BEL assessment for a new building, go through the process. It's really not that hard to do, and it gives you a base upon which to launch some of the planning and the strategizing and the tactics that you will have around making a more fire safe environment around yourself. So I think that's really, really important. So they're the standards. The other thing I borrowed this from the Tasmanian Fire Service because I thought it was a really cool graph or infographic that where I look at it and go, well, what's your fire support ecosystem look like? I mean, if you live in a fire-prone part of the world, it's kind of like there's a narrative that drought is almost abnormal and we should be surprised by it. It's kind of like we should be surprised by being in a fire-prone landscape. Well, we shouldn't be surprised by either. If there's no fire this year or there's no drought this year, well, then we kind of look like here in Victoria at the moment. We're going, yippee! We've had no fires for 2 years, and we haven't had a drought for 2 years, and people are lulled into a sense of security. Just as I'm sure people were going through the process of last year in Western Australia and enjoying all of that rainfall and maybe getting flooded and all of the rest of it, unfortunately. But we're looking at that going, wow, this is a great place to be. We've got all this water, and then kapow, you got the summer that you had. So I think where I get to with this is that it's really helpful, and I talk about this in the context of people who are trying to navigate the complexity of life anyway, being a modern human, is understanding the ecosystem of government, understanding, and more broadly in this case, saying, all right, what's the fire support ecosystem that I live within? And how can that help with my planning around and my security and my mental health management as I consider the trauma of the threat of fire, which people have each year. Man, you've had fires over there. How many of you have been affected by fire and saw the smoke and it caused a visceral trauma reaction? Right? I don't want to harbour on that, but it does that. We are in those situations a flight or fright animal. Simple as that. It's epigenetic. We're hardwired for that response. So, because of our own ecological history. So, we've got to understand that, and we've got to rationalize that somehow as best we can, and then expand on that by trying to understand, well, where do we fit in that ecosystem? And what parts of the ecosystem are threats to us, and what parts of the ecosystem are available to us? What's their capabilities? How accessible they are? And what role do I have to play in them? So I looked in this. So thanks for that opportunity. I spent a bit of time looking around at infographics from different jurisdictions to sort of say, all right, well, what does your bushfire survival plan look like? And the Tasmanians, I thought, did the nicest job. So we've got them. They feature in a few things here. I looked at the West Australian, the Victorian, the South Australian, the New South Wales, and they just hired the wrong graphic designer, I think, because they've all got the same information, but just not prepared as well. But I think it's really helpful to, in a fire plan, well, it's necessary in a fire plan, I should say, to really be clear about what your responses will be as the fire danger ratings change, and what you're ready to do. And so be very clear about that. So some sort of agreement, when they're, and Alan Savory, in his development of holistic management, planned grazing, one of the first things that he did was appropriate a management framework called an aide memoire, or a memory aid from the French. It's a militarist platform or framework to help people to help leaders, officers in battle situations to have a triage of responses according to the range of scenarios, some of which are unpredictable, but to do as best they can that planning. So I think that we need to consider having an aide memoire of sorts when it comes to our own individual bushfire plans, and make them known to the community that you're a part of. Because as we find so often, and all the various royal commissions and inquiries repeatedly make this clear, that communications are things that are parts of the ecosystem that fail. And it's hard to communicate in these scenarios. We don't want to be an interference to the communications which are absolutely necessary. So it's important for us to communicate when there isn't a fire and go through drills and be prepared, so that we understand that so we don't even have to think about it. There's no second guessing when there isn't time to second guess. So I think it's really, really important to do that. Planning tools also from CSIRO. CSIRO have done a magnificent job, I think, in supporting a lot of this effort in understanding how we, with our European style of existence on this continent, can persist, perhaps, with all of the conditions that we face. And so they've got a really great bushfire best practice guide, which I'd highly recommend that each of you spend some time either just flicking through or spending some serious time with. So, and I'll look at some of this as we go through. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but if we look at the headings, there's stuff about the bushfire basics, there's about regulations, where there are regulations and they've assembled them, what to do with new builds, what to do with retrofit. So that's another tab, but it's the same list of sub-tabs there. And then what your bushfire hazards are. So it looks at hazard identification, assessment, and then your BEL assessment. And we'll look at it through that lens in a moment. And then siting and design, and we'll look at that more broadly as well, based on some of my experience and those that I follow and respect. And then all of your landscaping stuff and what you can do there. So this is obviously not just for farms, it's also for urban landscapes, because Australia is a highly urbanised country. And when I look at it, I can think, when most people, or a lot of people on farms, develop a little suburban lot, it's just a bit bigger on their farm. That's not unusual. And so if you've got those, if you've got that siting characteristic to your archetype, to your homestead and your main home building envelope, then there's a lot of stuff that you can learn from what's being done in urban environments, and ditto. I think when we're in urban environments, living on peri-urban fringes, there's a lot that we can learn and should be doing, I think, to reduce fire risk to more closed settlements as well. So, but that's sometimes a bit hard to discuss because it involves vegetation management. And when we start, and if you want to start a really good pub fight, well, then vegetation management is a really good one to start with. Start the ball rolling. So, psychology and holistic context. We looked at the AIM method or methodology in terms of that when we've penned this section in the water chapter of the Regrarian's Handbook, that we wanted to look at so psychologically, how are you around anticipation and setting expectations as to what you are likely to face, how you're likely to react, etc. And that follows through with some of this stuff here and some of that rave I just had there. Just how prepared are you in the anticipation of these things? What drills have you had, and so on, to try and allay some of the responses that might otherwise put you in danger by you being in a panic situation when actually there's no necessity for you to be in one. So it's like it's a crude analogy for this would be an electric fence. People say you get a shock from an electric fence. No, you get a shock because you've backed into it and don't know that it's there, and it's shocked you. If you go and touch an electric fence, that's not a shock. That's you not paying attention, to be quite crude. So it's something that we, if we're going to live in this world and we're going to live in these places, then we need to get on board with the dangers and all that goes with that. And part of that is doing some training. Part of that is getting involved and preparing yourself for all of these different things that get thrown at us, whether it's fire or flood or anything else that's going on. Identification stage is about you coming to terms with your broad psychological and physical reactions to stress, identifying what they are and understanding why they occur. And we talk about this in the first few weeks of the Rex. Get to know yourself. If you don't know yourself by now, it's probably a good time to start and know, why do you get angry? Why do you get stressed? Why do you react in particular ways? So that's a help. And then look at what management we can put ourselves through so that when we have really stressful situations, how might we be able to better control our reactions? So I think that's a really important part. And again, when we look at the climate of the mind as being, the hardest thing to change, as I put out there years ago, it's something we have to work on. And that's why it's at the top of our show when it comes to the Regrarians platform. So coming to that is the holistic context process is one of the leading methods to sort of help with some of this. It's by no means exclusive. There's lots of other methods that are out there which we have discussed in the Rex, be it some of the more formal psychological analyses that are out there, know yourself analyses that are out there, and so on. And then there's also professionals. And if there are any issues that you have with mental health or concern, because this is what this is about as much as anything else, then seek professional help. And if that's uncomfortable, well, then maybe seek the help of friends as a starting point. But don't be quiet about it. Talk to each other and get that going. Now, in terms of the broader knowledge, there is a lot of stuff out there about fire. It's actually it's about a book. It's a normal sized bookshelf, I would say, if you go to a bookshop. And one line on here of books that really didn't exist much before is the top line. That is of Aboriginal Australians, or the acknowledgement of Aboriginal Australians in the literature that's available. So, Victor Stephenson, who many of you will have heard, and he's come to some fame over that, especially following the 2019 fires in Eastern Australia, and some of his responses. He got onto Q&A and all the rest of it a few times, and became a sort of the person you called up if you wanted an Aboriginal Australian to talk about fire. This recent, and then he wrote that book and released it. There's the book that's been recently released, which I talked about before. It's more of a general piece, I would say, from my reading of it. It's not one that specifically is about strategy with fire or how you do cultural burning. Then there's some of the stuff around the Royal Commission that occurred for natural disaster arrangements years ago, and some of that I did find on here, and I did have it, but it didn't fit, and it's awfully illegible. A literature review, which is a paper which is about to be released, which has pretty well every book or every paper that's been written about cultural burning practices in this country. And building on that, people like Rodney Mason and his colleagues, who've done some really great work in the southwest of New South Wales, in the Monaro Cooma region. The sort of Kosciuszko to coast region of that part of the world. And then there's the classics. I've not met Joan, but Joan lives in the town that I live in now, Castlemaine, and she is, I would say, the doyenne of fire safety, bushfire safety information that's out there. Her books are all awfully clear and all the rest of it. And then there's David Holmgren, who I mentioned earlier, and I have to thank always for his great work. This book was, it's almost a booklet because it's not that long, but it was submitted following the Ash Wednesday fires of 1993. There was a competition, if I recall correctly, and he submitted this as part of the competition for sort of how do we stop this from happening again? Clearly, a couple of decades later, it did in 2019. 2009 it did again, and then in 2019 again. So it's and we'll look at this book a bit more closely. It's available as an ebook for $10. When I came over to Western Australia in, I'm going to say 2016, again as a guest of the Peel Harvey Catchment Council, it was Luke Parker at the time. I spoke to David, and he gave me a box of sort of say seconds versions of these books. So, it's very current. So if I was going to look at any books in this lot to get, I think that the reintroducing land management practices draft is a very good one, and that's going to be available too because it's an open PDF. I think that the Fire Country is instructive, though it's largely framed with experience of people of Northern Australia, which is, again, quite different. Some of the practices are the same, but some are quite different. And then either or both of Joan Webster's books, there's a lot of overlap. So it probably, at the very least, the essential bushfire tips. The Flywire House, I think, is an absolute must because most of the pieces in this are not integrated enough. And David is an integrationalist as the permaculture co-originator, so that just goes with it, and a West Australian by birth to boot. And then when we want to look at sort of the more broader stuff. I think Stephen Pine, I first read Stephen Pine's Burning Bush, A Fire History of Australia, not long after it was released. I think it was about 94 or 95. And it was like, wow, this guy and he described himself as a pyrophyte or a pyrophile. I can't remember, one of the two. And listening to him in podcasts and whatever, he's a very intriguing individual. But he's written his writings on to help us understand why we've got to where we've got are really, really instructive, which is why I've got them on that line. So if you look at it, we've got the Aboriginal considerations and perspective, I suppose, on the top, a more integrated Western way of looking at it, where we consider all of our built environment that we've brought with us and the way that we've created more sedentary living conditions and the way that we've decided to manage vegetation and so on, is covered there. And then the final line is more, what's our fire history? How have we got to where we've got is very helpful. So that does that framing, I think. Well, that's how I look at it at this stage, as a sort of a first stab at it anyway. The geography layer, this is where we start to look, as I mentioned before, at landscape features more broadly, landforms, the relief, so the change in height of a landscape. Are we steep? Is it gentle? What are the differences in heights across a property and so on that we get from our contour maps? Slope levels and orientation to the sun, land use and condition of both what we've got and more broadly. And the Bell assessment is a part of this layer, I think. Then the psychological preparedness of the broader community that's around us. How are they, or the psychographic of them as well? And then all of the emergency services and, where are they on the map, right? So we're relating this to a map. Where are these things? Where are they situated? What's our access to them and so on? So the CSIRO Best Practice Guide has created this bushfire hazard identification checklist. And I think it's, again, these are fast and easy things that you can just do when you have your discretionary time. Or otherwise, or you as a professional human or a professional land manager, you put this into your time management to go, I'm going to be doing this when it's pissing down rain and there's not much else to do. I've got all my jobs done. I'm going to slot in this time, or I'm going to pick a time in the year on my Google Calendar, and that's going to be when I do this stuff. I'm just going to spend the day, and so are you next to me. So we'll do that and get a bit of an understanding of what's going on. You can pay someone else to do this for you and then pretend that you understand what it's about, right? Obviously, there is a place for professional advice, and you may well, and it's quite reasonable in a lot of cases that you would get that professional advice because you don't have the competency to do that work. But that doesn't say that you shouldn't still go through some of the process that they're going through yourself. If you are serious about, I believe, if you are serious about minimizing the risks to yourself and your loved ones and to the property that you cherish, then, and the community that you're part of, then please educate yourself. Please put yourself through some of these processes. I mean, anyone who's spent the last 3 minutes listening to me rabbit on while I've had this slide on here, you've probably already done it, right? Just there and then. It doesn't hurt. The other thing that we've done, and there's already an overlap when it comes to the REX program that we've already provided to you, and there's another one on at the moment if you want to still join us, is all of the mapping. It's an unbelievably good time to do this. Can you imagine doing this in the 90s when A, there barely were personal computers, and B, there wasn't Google Earth, and you couldn't just zoom on in straight away. You didn't have all of, there's this ubiquitous mapping access which everyone has access to. It's ubiquitous. And you can do the kind of assessment that no one else has been able to do as efficiently ever before. So use it. It's really not that difficult, and I think it's kind of fun. It's interesting. It's a lot more interesting than some of the things that are on TV at the moment. So especially if you've binged everything and got through it all, waiting for the new stuff to arrive will perhaps make some of this that. It's also something that you can workshop with others. If you, and as community leaders, who some of you are, or are emerging to become, you can share this stuff and say, hey, have you done that work? Have you looked at that? Or in your analysis, you come together at a community meeting and you say, hey, it looks like, that we've got some problems there, so you can start to use some of these resources and be an active citizen. David Holmgren's book, Flywire House, I think does a really great job of explaining fire behaviour. Fire behaviour is obviously complex and can't be addressed by one simple infographic as I've got on here, but it does help. It is still quite reasonable to understand that interaction between where we are in a landscape and how that's going to influence the impact of fire upon us. So ridge tops are exposed. I am a frequent critic when I look at what I see as a more recent phenomena of people building houses on ridge tops. It's been made able to happen by basically by an advance in technology with remote power systems. That's largely been because before, most people, even wealthy people, couldn't afford to put the power line up there, buried or otherwise, or they wouldn't do it. But now power systems allow them to go and put themselves in precarious, exposed positions, and pressure pumps are the other thing, and large rainwater tanks. You put all of those things together, it gives a capability to people to put themselves in vulnerable positions. So please consider that. Please consider walking to your view, not living on top of the world, right? Because it makes it more dangerous for everyone. Because when you do that, you're not only putting yourself at risk and all of your capital, but you're also putting at risk those who will come to try and protect your property. So, yeah. So there are more ideal places in the landscape to put yourself. If you're already in a place and you don't have a choice, right? So what we've largely got to do then is look at understanding what could happen. And in some cases that might involve, and I don't think this is a bad thing, actually getting an experienced CFA or whatever your fire authority person to come out or persons and give you a bit of a walkover. I mean, they are out there in the thick of it, and a lot of them have got a lot of experience and knowledge about A, the local conditions, but B, fire behaviour, and they'll be able to spot and some of the concerns that there may be, and then some of the strategies that you might put in place to mitigate that risk, because you are in a vulnerable position. There's really no places that aren't vulnerable, but there are places that are more vulnerable than others, and the relationship between your position in the landscape and its relationship to vegetation are probably the biggest impact there. It helps to understand all of these ratings and what they mean. A lot of people will see, this. I see these things, and it's sort of like, it's almost like a game show. For some people, it doesn't really resonate. And I think that's part of that is because they just don't understand the science that goes behind determining the fire danger ratings and the fire danger indexes. I mean, in Western Australia, the fire danger index is on any day across the year at a level of 80. That puts it in the extreme across the period of the year when it's not raining pretty well. So, and you know that, right? So, there's not much point even having you should just have the green and the reds, and that's about it, because that's where you are. That's the part of the world that you exist in. So, with that, try and get a better understanding and appreciation of just what category of bushfire attack you are going to be subject to as a result of the distances to vegetation and the kind of vegetation community and the slope that you are addressing. Many of you will be if you look at the determination of category of bushfire attack, many of you are going to be in the extreme and a fire zone rating there, or category. Step 2 of the bushfire best practice guide from CSIRO is to map out the bushfire hazards on your property. So this is just a straight cut and paste from them, and that should seem fairly obvious. So where are the different assets on your property? And again, you have Google Earth access, so that means that you can get all of this relatively easily. I mean, now we're going to take a helicopter view with the Google Earth, but then you're going to come down onto the ground and you're going to actually check out what species you've got, and you're going to start to understand what those species, what that vegetation, what its capacity is in a fire. I mean, you can pretty well strike a line through most eucalypts, right? You can pretty well strike a line through most, anything that has, if you crush the leaves and it has an aroma, any volatiles that come off that, it's going to burn, and it's going to burn hot. So pine trees, cypress trees, most of the conifers, with a few exceptions. The araucarias would be one exception. But the eucalypts, the corymbias, most of the Myrtaceae family, so Melaleucas, Leptospermums, etc., the tea trees, etc. Acacias are largely, because of the way that they hold on to their residual vegetation, residual biomass, and so on. So get an understanding of what vegetation can do, and we'll talk about that further. Calculate the distances. So this is for new properties. So we're going to look at now the Bell assessment tool that CSIRO has. It's an online tool that you can go to. If you've got a new development, you're going to calculate the Bell distances from different building envelopes in particular, because that's what this reference is, that you will have, and can you stay within the Bell low or 12.5 sort of regime? Because some people will position themselves into higher rating sites and then kind of get away with it by building a building which has which follows the code for that area, for that particular fire rating. And if you can avoid doing that, please avoid doing that, because it just doesn't put you in a good environment, and like I said, it doesn't do that for others either. Then you've got existing, so you can look at where you are now and then put it through, and just so that you can get a sense of exactly what issues we've got in front of us. It's a very, very good active website, this one. Same with the contours across the property. So when you look at the topography of your landscape and the slope, the degrees of slope that you've got, what influence is that going to have according to whether it's a new development or an existing one, and then what rating will come from that. To put that in context, radiant heat flux, kilowatts per square metre, I mean, that's still pretty bloody hot, right? 9.7 kilowatts is the output of a lot of stoves, right? Even a little Twiggy will put out about 5 or 6 kilowatts of energy. So, when we look at this, the energy that's generated from fire, even when we're distant from it, can be quite high. So you're not off the hook here. It's just giving you a bit of leg room. So water. Just let me have a drink. So the checklist here, we're looking at design and the placement of key features, the interoperability of fire and irrigation systems. I think that's a really important thing and is not often discussed. A lot of people just talk about, oh yes, I'm going to have a fire system. Well, what do you do every other day of the week when it's not operating, or touch wood, it never gets used for that purpose? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that interoperability is quite an important thing, I think. Have you got mains water? Is that your only supply? Do you know anything about that system? Is it pumped? Is it gravity? A lot of the time they're pumped. You may not know that. And, mains power is one of the first things that goes out when there's a wildfire situation. So be clear on that, and then look at, all right, well, what sort of strategies can I put in place around my domicile, around my property to mitigate that risk? And again, some of those strategies will tie in with broader everyday irrigation strategies or grey water treatment strategies and so on. That leads us to dams and wetlands. A wastewater treatment system can be and is best expressed as a wetland, right? So what can that do in terms of have an impact on some of the on mitigating fire risk around my property? What vegetation communities can that support? And would I put it in a place where it's actually a really strategically placed feature for that reason? Dams, again, when we think of them, or we've got largely they're often the primary source of water in West Australian farms for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So what's their location and proximity? Is there gravity potential? What's the available storage volume? Pump readiness, all of that stuff. Do we have access to fire tankers? Then we look at tanks themselves. Their placement, are they dedicated? Do they have a dedicated storage reserve? Do they have stores couplings, or whatever the appropriate coupling is that you checked with your local fire service? What's the material that you're using? Do you understand which materials are more of a problem in fire situations? Pipes, their depth, the materials that you're using, where, you've got all these beautiful plastic risers everywhere with a lovely underground piping system. Well, the plastic risers, your underground might go all right, but the risers probably won't. So there's all of that to consider. That's not to say you have to do that everywhere, but where you've got where you're on a kind of a war footing and you're looking at, just this raw protection strategy of major assets, that's where you start to use, really critical and sometimes more or critically chosen and more expensive materials, because their cost is less than obviously the cost of all of the physical and loss and trauma that will follow. What are the capacity of those systems? Then we get to pumps. Start with the assumption of failure. Pumps are the one day that beautiful old Honda pump or the new one that you've got, that's always started first go, and you go to start it and it doesn't start. What do you do then? What have you got as other strategies there? And we'll look at some of that. There's a bit of investment going on here. I mean, I'm sure you've already started to go, bloody hell, there's a lot going on here. And I think, some of this should be rewarded in some way by excuse me, some of this should be rewarded by insurers. That's a whole other conversation. But some of this should also be, if we've got boons from government royalties and whatnot, some of those boons should be put out there to subsidise some of these things, so that so just like years ago we got subsidies, at least over in Victoria, for putting in wastewater treatment systems of particular types, or grey water treatment systems. We've got subsidies for that. I think some of this stuff is probably of a higher grade of importance than some of those things. So, so dedicated firefighting systems. What have you got? The interoperability, and so on. And then sprinklers. What material use, performance, placement, and interoperability. So in the handbook, I had this schematic, which many of you who did the Rex would have recall, where we're looking at that classic hill country profile: a tank up on the hill, dams up a bit higher, and whatever it is, and then the house, not the other way around. Because if you've got the house up top and the dam's down there and the tank's all below, then you are relying on energy other than gravity to get things around. And gravity is the most reliable thing that you have in these situations. In terms of water storages, the most reliable water storage that you will have will be a plumbed dam, a plumbed dam that is higher than your building envelope. There is nothing more reliable, because there's the embankment of the dam won't burn down, right? All tanks can and will burn down. There are no safe tanks. There are some concrete and steel zinc aluminum tanks are safer than others. They're less flammable than others, particularly if they're kept full. Plastic tanks, etc. Many of you will have seen already the impacts of fire on those systems. That's not to say that they aren't useful and don't have a place, but when we're thinking about the overall strategy of what we put where for and that we are trying to rely upon, then please consider material use, because when you do rely upon it, and it's usually far, far away, you're not going up to defend your header tank, right? You're defending the area around your property, and you're taking care of all the things that are going on with your livestock and whatever else you've got going on in your life. So you really do want to have solid estate facilities and placement of key elements as you can. Now, when it comes to flat country, that's a bit more difficult. And of course, there's a lot of flat country. As soon as you come down from the escarpment and you go out to the coast, there's a tremendous amount of flatter country which doesn't have the kind of profile that's above there. So what do we do there? Well, how do we do this so that it's almost safe from failure? How do we make it so it's solid state, where the machines break down or don't start? How will it happen? And that's where we go back to some old technology. We go back to header tanks. How many times have you driven around the country in the last period since the advent of the pressure pump? You see tank stands everywhere with no tanks on them, or falling over, or whatever else. It's like I drive around the countryside going, oh God, I hate pressure pumps. And then they're annoying, and they're good to keep. They're good to put. I think they're the best thing to put by a guest house, so your guests don't stay for longer than 2 days, which is usually the use by limit. I think it's fit. I think a pressure pump and a fish on the counter is probably the best way to get rid of them. Anyway, if we've got flat country, then this is a schematic I drew up yesterday just to sort of consider the average scenario and what some of the things that we might do, where we might have in our frame, starting from left, deciduous, low flammability trees and shrubs, and a coverage of irrigated landscape, maybe just a hectare. I don't know what the regulations are in Western Australia, but I know that in Victoria, at least, you can irrigate 1 hectare of your landscape. House and domestic allowance, it's called. I don't know. Check that out, because there is a that provision, and people don't necessarily use that very well. Now, a hectare is a reasonable area. It's 100 metres by 100 metres. And most of you, when you look at the proximity of, well, if you look at the scale of your building envelope, well, most houses are 20 to, these days even 20 to 30 metres by 20 to 30 metres if you look at the whole footprint, verandas and outbuildings and all of that sort of thing. And then you've got the sheds and so on. So if you were able to irrigate a hectare and do that reasonably, then that's going to take, if you do it properly and have management, then in most cases, that's probably going to take anywhere between 400 to 600,000 litres of water a year, right? If you do it with the right gear, such as low pressure field sprinklers and so on. So some of these systems that we've got in here in terms of the header tank and the pumps and that sort of thing, some of those things may well fail, like the one that's out on the dam and the solar pump are probably not going to work too well while things are going on, right? But they will work for the other days of the year, and they are reliable technology and relatively low cost technology, so they can get you there. You can have that in concert with some with a petrol pump or a diesel pump that can help you with firefighting. I think what we do too often though, and this is probably most acute with this diagram, this flat country diagram, is that we set our places up, or we set ourselves up so that we have to defend ourselves on the day when we haven't done the work for the rest of time to set the landscape up so that it's equipped. And we have seen time and time and time again properties which have been left because it's been an extreme an extreme fire rating, and so people have been told to evacuate. People have evacuated, and they've done the right things in terms of their landscape maintenance and so on, and their houses have not burned down. That has happened time and time again. I remember very well going even back in 2009 when I was working around Kinglake following the Black Saturday fires of that year. 2009 was the fire, and then 2009-10 I did some work with people down there, and I went to so many properties where people had left and they had done a lot of the things that we're talking about, that we will continue to talk about here, and their properties did not burn down because their day-to-day management leading up to that point had created a landscape which was much less flammable than it would otherwise be. So there's those things. So having that hectare, if you can get away with it, I'd push that, because I think, gee, what a form of civil disobedience to have a bit more of a green zone. And if someone came along and told me that I couldn't be doing that, I'd probably having a fairly strong word with them. Obviously, there's a limit to that. You don't want to take the piss, but we're talking about our protection here. So that's what I'll be looking at. So look at that as well in the scope of the water resources that you have. Part of that is saying, all right, well, I might need to boost that up a bit. So if I have the capacity to liberate some capital and liquidate some assets and get my dams dug out a bit deeper or whatever, so that I've got a bit of water up my sleeve, then do it. Build some tanks, get some stuff done, put some money into some pipe. Don't buy the car that you want to buy next year just because you think it's a good thing. Put that money into buying some pipe and something that's really important. So water and fire, again, David Holmgren, his work is really instructive, and there's some changes, I would say, in some of the materials that have occurred since 1994-5 when this book was released, but it still has a high degree of currency in terms of how much water you put behind, the relative placement of things, and so on. Very instructive. and Joan Webster's manuals have similar advice. Now, of course, following Ash Wednesday, and particularly following Black Saturday, there was a bit of a boon in roof sprinklers. So the house here is one of my old mates, Ralph, who lives in the middle of the Otways, the eastern end of the Otways, in the middle of just this. I go there and just look around and go, how you have not been burnt out by now, Ralph, is just unbelievable. They've been very lucky they haven't had a fire. It is one of the most dangerous places on earth for fire. Anyway, he's got a set of roof sprinklers, which are the old rotor frame setup with a galvanized iron pipe, and he's got a header tank. He's on a flat landscape, so I don't think it'll save him. But there's other features I really like about this photo. One of the things about this photo, which I'll discuss further when we get to the building section, is the lack of clutter and its tidiness. I'll say this now and I'll repeat it later. Bushfire loves a mess. Fires love clutter. They just love it. So if you want to increase that risk, then do that. Look at the volume of water that you've got and consider some of these features, some of these different innovations which are out there. So the old rotor frame, they've been around for years. And a lot of people stopped using them because they put too much water out. They're really, they put a high volume of water. The original ones, I think, were called the rotor frame Rainbird, and they're fantastic. If you want to create a sort of a tropical forest sort of vibe and watch your dam disappear, then they are a really good irrigation feature. And then we've got these other types, which are these sort of swirling types, and they put out water in the swirling pattern, which is often how a firefighter will work as well. As they're fighting a fire, they'll put water out in a swirl to sort of build a humid face, instead of it all just going in one where it's all quite directed, as opposed to creating a face to it. Now these features and leaf guards and all of those sorts of things, they're at the end of the line, but it is hard to burn a place that is completely wet. Now, I would say that this place probably would be lucky to survive, because knowing Ralph's place, the vegetation that you see behind you, which is basically from ground all the way up to 20 metres, and there's hundreds, if not thousands of hectares of it around him. He's just got his little opening in the middle of it. Even with all of these features, it's unlikely that this place would survive, because he just doesn't have a cleared enough environment around him. The intensity of that fire would be a challenge to this, with everything working. But the house has a lot of good features, low profile and so on. So we'll talk about that later. I didn't quite get to fix that. Hang on. I'll just fix that. I did another slide. I didn't get to do this one. So this was looking at some other sprinkler systems out there. This one's called the Platypus, and it's showing it in operation. So it's a sort of a Rainbird type as well. But with this one, they're putting it along the gutters, on the roof line and so on. I think Jeff Power was the one who introduced this one to me. Some of you might have already installed it. And yeah, from the people that I've talked to who have installed it, they're very happy with it. I've not actually spoken to anyone who's experienced a fire with these systems in place. So at least from my perspective, it's imaginary. But in reading the reports, it seems like these are pretty good systems. But again, they're the end of the line. They're not the only thing that one should rely upon. All right. Other people can contribute to that. The other thing is portable pumping systems. And there's a few good ones here. So there's ones which are just on little hand trolleys. There's the sort of one that we put the pig, as we call them over here, where you just got an IBC or some sort of tank in the back of it, in the that's on a little slide that you can slide in and out. It's got the pump all integrated into it. You can slip that onto a trailer as well, put it in the back of the ute. There's a sort of dedicated types, or there's the sort of more homemade types. The one that's the yellow trailer there, that's actually by Ross Escape Modules. That one actually has a water tank which doubles as an escape module. So you can actually empty the tank and go inside of it, and you can be in there for half an hour to an hour and survive. It's been designed in that way, which is quite interesting. I wouldn't probably like to do that, but if you're forced, then that's what you do. These systems, which you will have noticed in the Rex I've promoted over time as an option. I'm not a big fan of irrigation per se. I think that it's a proxy kind of for us not doing the kind of management which promotes or extends photosynthesis as well as it could. But, be that as it may, we'll often find in environments which have low rainfall or no rainfall over summer that there still is growing grass and vegetation in the environment, and there's management reasons for why that is there, and that usually doesn't come over the fence into a farm because that management's not being applied. But that's a whole other story. But when we look at that rave about having an area, that 1 hectare area around our domicile, around our building envelope, these are really great systems. And you can build a poor boy version of these quite easily. The wobbler, for example, or the wobble tee, those sorts of things, you can get them really cheaply. You don't need to go and buy a full-on K-line or Irapod system, although they are very good and they're not that expensive. I think a homestead style 3 or 4 pod K-line system is about $1,000 now, so it's not that expensive and highly portable. If those are fitted, so they're, as you can see, most of them have got fitted with impact sprinklers. Well, then they require more pressure. But if you swap those heads out for the new wobble tees from Wobblers, from Wobble Tee themselves, the Australian company, or Seninger, you can get systems which run on under a bar of pressure, which is awesome, because that means that if you've got a tank up, on a stand, you can still run these systems. But again, those systems, we don't want to necessarily have to be running them on that day when it's a fire day. We may in the morning and put it on to wet the ground and get all of that happening. But when the fire's on, we don't necessarily want them to be running. We want to be scurrying around worrying about other things going on. So it's more of the lead up to the prospect of an event, or just general practice, to have that environment. And what do we want when we come home to our properties? We want to have a nice, green, cool environment. Most Australian houses are designed appallingly for the climate. And so vegetation around our houses, whether it's green grass or other green vegetation and shade, really helps to improve the livability of our poorly designed structures. So there's a lot to go with this. But what we can do as well is do this in a really water efficient way. Now, in terms of the checklist for access, the general question here is, or general point here is, having multiple emergency accesses, being connected to water infrastructure, avoiding cul-de-sacs across the whole place. So trying to create it so that, and we've talked about this with just general layouts of farms anyway, with the access layer, trying to have it just like with our water systems, often have it so it's all connected and it's looped. Design and dimension for emergency vehicles, have the alignment grades being less than 10 degrees, and have overtaking and filling turnouts. You don't want to have it so that on the day when it's all happening, that there's no room for vehicles, for emergency vehicles or yours who are operating in an emergency to be crammed up. That's not a good place to be. So bridges, think about that. They've got to have a minimum of 6 metres of vertical clearance for vegetation and other obstructions. We need to know what the load is. I mean, you've got a 30-ton or 15-ton fire truck coming along that's fully laden. They want to be sure that they can cross it. Same with the sign depth. You can still have running streams in a fire area. So, do people know what the depth is? Again, we don't need people being stranded at any stage in these situations. Perimeter and fire trails. Again, this is where there's a contention around some of the vegetation clearing laws, and they often get brought back after there's either been a change in administration or some sort of major conflagration, which has caused people to go, yeah, maybe some of this vegetation is not as important as human lives or the destruction of some of the property. Maybe it's the quality of vegetation and the quality of the biodiversity and the ecosystems that they are a part of that's more important than just having vegetation. There's those sorts of things which don't often get brought into the discussion. And then signed access to, if you really want to go to town, if you've got that risk, you're in that place, put a sign up which says water here, right? Steel posts and steel plate and a bit of paint can go a heck of a long way. Even if you just put some of the things that we've done is use a star picket and we've painted the top blue, right? And that's right beside where there's a hydrant. You can do that for just your general hydrants so people know where they are. But if that pipeline also has the ability to have a takeoff that a fire truck can jump onto, or that you can come along with your little IBC and fill up and so on. Because sometimes your 2-inch system or your 3-inch ring main system that you have, if you set that up and then have steel risers coming out of that and cam lock fittings and brass gate valves or ball valves, you're in the game. I mean, you've got even off a relatively low head of pressure, a 2-inch pipe when it's fully open, it spreads a lot of water out. So you've got that capacity. So know where they are. And then when you look at your external access, where you've got frontages, have more gates, have more openings. It's really time consuming for people to go and cut through the 7 strands of wire that you've got with 6, 4 or 5 meters spaced star pickets and all that when they need to get through. I wonder at times how we manage that with the gates. Do we allow gates to be open? Because a lot of people are insecure about, for a variety of reasons, whether they've got a lock the gate, don't come and frack my country, thank you very much. They've got that. You have to lock the gate to lock the gate. How we reconcile some of those activities with maintaining access in these times. The West Australian Government Department of Fire and Emergency Services gave us some really good principles here as far as what our access requirements are. So that's stuff to consider in terms of turnout areas or passing areas, how much width we need, the radii of turns, the weight of vehicles, all of those sorts of things. So there's a really good guide there to constructing and maintaining fire access, which or fire breaks, I can't see it, but that piece I read through, it's really good. So there'll be those things to have a look at. Ecosystems. I think I'm going that way. I'm not going to call this the forestry layer anymore. I think I'm stuck on ecosystems. But anyway, we'll just have that rave with you. We'll introduce that concept quietly to the West Australians. So general design placement, understand vegetation flammability, avoidance of ladder fuels. Looking at, you like it, Mick? I think you might have even suggested it, mate. Um, you like Swan Lager? Is that your beer? Is that the prize? Avoidance of ladder fuels, um, lift and clearwood pruning of flammable trees. I'm not proposing that we get rid of every flammable tree that's out there, but there's certainly things that we can do to limit their danger. And so let's do that. And then management for biological decomposition and digestion, as opposed to chemical decomposition, right? With fire being the most acute version of chemical decomposition, right? So try and get, and that means then try to get biodiversity back, try to get biotobation processes. So we've got marsupials who are in there turning the stuff over, that are eating things, that are doing all of that. Get livestock involved so that their enteric digestion processes are turning materials over and getting them so that they're digested and those loads are less, and so on. So shelter belts, species mixes which include low flammability vegetation, or all species low flammability. Lift prune trees again. So you know what I mean by that, where you clear all of the stems off the tree up to a particular height, so that you don't get the ladder fuels, which are such a big danger, and overall help to reduce the potential for a fire to escalate from a ground fire to being a crown fire. Once it gets in the crown, as we understand, the risks overall increase considerably. Integration with access, that standard 60-degree windward fire direction profile, have sufficient permeability so we avoid venturis. There's enough turbulence as it is without increasing that by the way that we've developed our shelter belts. So plant grass suppressing trees along fence lines. Casuarinas are fantastic for that. And yes, they produce a fuel, but the fuel is generally not that flammable. It's not as flammable as a lot of other species are, and it tends to turn over fairly well, particularly if we've got some of the aforementioned little ground dwellers flitting around. Livestock, what's the trigger point for you or them in terms of where they can go? Because there is a choice, and unfortunately, part of the trauma that I've heard from people who've been affected directly by fire has been, yes, it's been for themselves, but then it also goes to their livestock, whether it's their dogs or whether it's their cattle or their sheep or whatever form of livestock we have. So having allocated safe paddocks, which are cleared, which are irrigated, which are have a perimeter shelter of inflammable trees, fodder trees, shrubs, reliable and adequate water supply, suitability in case of flooding as well, right? So because we do get floods, some landscapes which as the people in New South Wales are finding right at the moment, landscapes which burnt terribly a few years ago, and you would have had in Western Australia over the winter and spring, landscapes which have burned have also flooded. So, and livestock are the meat in the sandwich on either situation. Utilisation in a landscape collaboration, and considering having this area as part of your yard complex, it makes sense to integrate these things. And of course, this landscape, this position, often will have our yarding complex within the broader homestead envelope. If it's not that way, it's not that way. But if you've got the capacity to go and put a bit of water out and irrigate that area, and then you consider that as part of a paddock in your grazing plan, then it's more likely that you'll maintain it because it's actually important to you. So there's those sorts of elements and to consider as part of that whole strategy, so that we can put animals, because the concept in reading some of the literature out there says, oh yeah, you should set things up so you can get animals onto trucks and all that sort of stuff. I mean, who's doing that? It just doesn't happen that often, that when you've got really severe fire situations, that people go and the first thing they think about is, I better go and ring up Joe Blow to get the B double in, the triple decker or the double decker, to come in and get all my animals off here. I mean, really, is Joe and Blow going to drive there? Not bloody likely. So it's more likely, and it's not done enough, that we actually create areas which again have this concept of interoperability, this concept of a landscape collaboration taking place. And then conserved forage. Haystacks, as we all know, are often causes of, because they haven't been managed properly to avoid spontaneous combustion. We've got a whole section in the forestry, still called the forestry chapter of the Regrarian's Handbook, which speaks to that, and there's lots of stuff out there about how to manage haystacks for that purpose. But then, what do we do there? If we have a fire, then we need feed. If our animals are still with us, then we need feed. And actually, as we'll discuss, that use of that feed in bale grazing and all of those sorts of things are actually part of our recovery phase. So, and generally in the district, yes, there will be other districts which will throw hay at you. But often it is the case that you have that double-edged sword where there's the conditions that have led up to a really bad fire season have also been really bad droughts. And so there's not necessarily a lot of feed going around. So if you do have that, then one of the things I would recommend is that, just as a backup in general, is having some silage pits, old-fashioned silage pits. I mean, people have dug up silage pits which are 25, 30 years old, and they've still been completely okay. Like the protein still been above the magic 8% and so on. But my strategy here, in considering this further today, when I just went through it all, I thought, well, here we have silage pits, which are often something that people will dig up in a really serious drought anyway. They go, oh yeah, my granddad put a silage pit in over there, and they go and get that. But associated with that, I thought, well, if you're going to have a silage pit, why wouldn't you bury some minerals as well? You've got to cover your silage pit when you bury it, ideally in some black plastic. I mean, you can do it without it, but it just means that the moisture's not going to get into it and degrade it. It'll last for just that much longer. So if you can cover your silage pit and then with plastic and then soil, and if you bang in there some minerals, your general mineral blocks, your stock licks, put them in there. If they've got a bit of urea in them, that's not a bad thing either, because that'll help to get the rumen to liberate some of that, more of that protein out of that forage as well. So those sorts of things, they're just the same as a lot of people over the last year have been buying lots of cans of tinned meat and beans and shit like that, because they thought COVID was going to create some sort of calamity, a complete societal collapse. It's really not that much different, and not that expensive to do, and not that just to get you through that period. You've got relatively stable materials, you can do that. So Rodney Mason put this together, I thought was interesting when it came to vegetation ecosystems management, that Aboriginal people do not like wild and unkempt areas. The sign of a poorly functioning system is the excessive build-up of dead plant material or litter. Aboriginal management aims to keep vegetation functioning and to minimise risk, which I think I've collected those statements out of part of this book. I think that some of that makes some serious sense. So, well, as I said before, if you keep a mess, then fire will love it, right? So declutter your landscape, and that's when I've talked to Aboriginal people who are fire managers. That's the kind of language they go. Oh, yeah, no, it's untidy. I want to get this a bit tidier, right? Now that at the same time is a anthropogenic way of looking at it through the eyes of an Aboriginal person. Others who are listening to this and others who have a different attitude to ecosystem management will feel differently. They'll feel that some of this mess, quote unquote, or unkempt wild nature of a place actually provides ecological niches for different species, and that is true. But it may well also more broadly create the kind of risks that we don't want to have. So the broader, again, I'll go to David because he's done such a lovely job looking at the shelter belts and the species that they are composed of. We're not proposing that you put exotic vegetation everywhere. It's always about what is there in the right place at the right time. But now, if you're going to start to carry on with that sort of attitude, I think you just need to even start looking at your housing. I mean, your housing is an ecological disaster generally in terms of resource use. Stop driving your car, stop doing all sorts of things, as opposed to thinking about, oh gee, I'm doing the wrong thing because I've got some exotics in my shelter belt or around my house. If you want to persist on a completely native diet, good luck doing that one, finding the species and so on. Anyway, rant over. It's really important to, again, understand the species that you have and look at the ones that are a threat and how can we isolate the threat. How can we manage them so that they are of less of a risk? That may involve some clearing. It may involve a lot of clearing. It may involve a lot of pruning. All right, so there'll be all of that. Then there's planting. A lot of planting goes. A lot of these species go a very long way. So think about that. And how does that all fit in with the general landscape that you are trying to create and the general microclimate effects that you are trying to create as a result of the species of vegetation you choose to put around you? And then zoom on in from that. How does this integrate? Where are your deciduous shade trees, which you are probably going to want? Where are your orchards? What are the species that are in that? Where's your lawn? Where's your cropping area if you've got a vegetable garden? All of that sort of thing. Where's your grey water system? What is your grey water system feeding in terms of trees? And all of those things. So that's all to consider. Andrew Thamo, I haven't met this gentleman, but I've been reading his work for a long time now, probably 15 or so years. I first came across him when I was reading about his silvicultural practices with this sort of small tree idea. I think that was in the late 90s or early 90s. Anyway, he's got some pretty cool resources there, which I thought were, being a local, were worth looking at, and often I've quoted them over the time. And looking at, when you look at what trees are flammable and what are not. Well, a lot of the species that we find useful as food-bearing species are really good like that. Millpost Farm, which I mentioned in the last Rex, that's a really great place. It was actually one of the first places that David Holmgren consulted to I think in the early 80s. And it's about 1,000-acre farm, and it's got a 1 hectare envelope thereabouts, which is all super sappy, super shady trees, exotic trees, all deciduous trees, and some very sappy, wet, inflammable evergreen trees as well, but mostly deciduous. And that has changed the environment of that building envelope on that farm. And of course, not only day to day changes the environment, but in the case of a fire, which, as I understand, this has not threatened this property, but were it to, it would be a lot better equipped than if that same vegetation was all at the bottom of that scale there of accelerants, which is what a lot of people have got. So things to consider in all of that. And go around, you don't have to go very far, unfortunately for you, for any of us living in where we do, either in southeastern Australia or southwestern Australia. You don't have to go very far to find areas that have been burnt out, and pay attention to the vegetation. And I'm talking about in the month after. Go and pay attention to what's burned and what hasn't. It's not, you're not being a voyeur. You're just paying attention. It's part of your research. So go and do that and see where that takes you. Buildings. The checklist I've got there is to avoid exposure and integrate the connections, as we've talked about before, and remove the critical have critical management of flammable trees. Deciduise, which is a word I've come up with. Others might have come up with the same, but increase the number of deciduous species that you have around your building envelope. Provide access to emergency vehicles, declutter and remove all the mess. The decluttering thing, that links partly to your economy. We've talked about this before in the Rex over time, and including the one that you all first had access to, and that is, when you go through and do an assessment of all of the machinery that you have, all of the assets that you have, it is a great opportunity to look at what capital is sitting there and not being used. It's kind of like your wardrobe. Some people have that rule: if I haven't worn it in a year, I throw it out. Well, you might have to establish some similar rules with the equipment that you have lying around, which is, I'll use it one day. No, you won't. Or maybe you will, but you can borrow it. It just creates clutter. So clean up, take that opportunity to do that. So often I see, tragic images, and when I get about and have a look at properties which have, as I have, and then gone and advised people and communities in this way, I've gone to properties and it's hard because you can take the steps back from what you are seeing as an outcome to why this tragedy occurred in large part. And a lot of it, I won't say it's completely avoidable, because there's some cases where it is hard to avoid, but a lot of it's avoidable, and a lot of it's got to do with our management of all of the things that we accumulate around us, and the way that we position them, and the way that we don't manage them. So architecture should be clean. That's why I mentioned the house before. Sorry, I lost my mind there. Low profiles, all of that sort of thing. We'll talk about that in a moment. Try and limit the use of flammable materials. Services should be all buried, protected, marked, as I talked about. Gas cylinders should be kept in a secure gas cage, because if they do happen to go, then they will explode. And if they explode, they're a bomb. They're the metal, they're shrapnel. So keep them in a cage. So at least if they do that, then they're kept relatively safe. We don't need shrapnel flying around everywhere. The roof, low profiles, gap sealed, all of those sorts of things. I mean, this is stuff that you should be going around and assessing. It's a valuable asset. No one wants to lose it. And then we've got the flywire stuff, having all of that. If you've got a stumped house, making sure that that's all flywired as well, with metal flywire or screens. Remove the welcome mats from your front doors on the fire days, because you don't want that to be your unwelcome mat, from an ember attack. Gutters, get all your leaf guards, all of that stuff's all generally available. And your downpipes should be, at least in the fire sector of your house, not be PVC, but be made of Zincalume, because it is the most fire-safe material in that case. And then sheds, all of the above, clear the perimeter, isolate flammable materials, considering the installation of a fireproof storage vault and or an accredited fire bunker. And fire loves a mess, so don't have one. So here we've got the house. Where do they burn from? They burn from the roof. They burn from underneath. The place is done either way because that's how most of them go. So getting, taking care of those critical points from the get-go is really important. Some of those concepts then go to the landscape that we're in, and it fits in with the whole solar passive rave, the way our house is aligned, all of that stuff. There's a lot of interoperability. There's a lot of integration in all of this. And even though these diagrams are from the 1990s, there's still a lot of currency there. Fire shelters have become more and more of a discussion, particularly since the Black Saturday fires in Victoria, and there's a number of them. There is a performance standard. As I understand it, there's only Victoria has I won't say a building standard, but the Buildings Council here have created accreditation for a number of shelters, all of which are mentioned here. So wildfire safety bunkers, which are a monolithic unit, which is prefabricated and buried into the ground and covered with soil, is one of those. Innovative building systems, which is that brownie coloured building there, which is a Hebel block system, both for storage of items and storage of humans. And then there's the Ross Escape modules, which are quite a different tech, but another technology that's out there which is accredited under that scheme. And then go back to the old days and looking at some of those principles. There's that shelter, and I'll just put that there as a overall concept. It's not one that's accredited, so it's something you should, if you're looking to do that, then that's something to consider. There are also asset protection systems out there. So if you are going to leave, you can't take everything because it takes too much time to load the car. Whether it's your hard drives, your photos, whatever it is, people do buy these systems, and I've seen them asset protection boxes, which are a few cubic meters in size, and I think they cost around $3,000 to $5,000. So without installation, so there's those sorts of things that are out there as well. Fencing, it's integration. Fencing is something that often gets deeply impacted. It's hard to stop that, really. We can reduce the impact by our general landscape management, of course. And we can also do things like, not have too much plastic involved. A lot of people now are using long life fencing, so-called Waratah long life, or other fencing materials which have a polymer coat. They have a fine polymer coat, and then they have the galvanizing material underneath that. I'd question some of that use. I don't really like it anyway, because I know that if it's polymer, that it's washing off into the environment over time and contributing to the overall level of nanoplastic pollution that we have already. So the Zincalume technologies of today are, I would say, in my observation, more than adequate for in a lot of cases. But then we look at ceramic insulators and all of those sorts of things. But when you got perimeter electric fences, which a lot of people have them so that they're stock proof regardless. So if the electricity goes down, which, if you've got a circuit of wire, you're going to have some polymer coated wire which goes under your gates and stuff. If you have a ground fire goes through, that's going to knock that out and short out, and that's done. So what do you do then about keeping your stock in? So just bear that in mind when you're looking at e-fences around your perimeters or other target or other areas, and manage that vegetation. Galvanized steel, we're in a very lucky period. There's all of these materials which make it much easier to build fences, but also to have fences which, not in most cases, but in some cases, particularly more grass fire situations, are less susceptible to damage or destruction. There's also the adaptable fixing of clips these days. You know, a Clipex fence, for example, and those posts, or the new Southern Wire clips that they've got, even to the extent the Waratah Geo clips, mean that you can, especially with the Clipex, you can unhook the fence. It doesn't take. So if you were to, like once upon a time, if you were to come up to a fence and you were to wanted to drive through it because there were no gates, then the whole fence, the cutters come out and the whole thing. Now, it would take as much time to cut that fence as it would to unhook it with Clipex. You only have to unhook it. Posts are usually 6 meters apart, thereabouts. You only need to unhook a couple of posts, which doesn't take a lot of time, and the slack of the wires will be down. You can just drive straight on through. So there's those sorts of things which passively make it a lot better. Now, the general checklist for soils are that there's the aid memoir for in general times, right? For holistic planned grazing, have us consider fire risk mitigation as part of steps 7 in the open plan or the growing season plan, or step 6 in the non-growing season or closed plan that you would have. And those steps are called the note paddocks requiring special attention. So those paddocks needing special attention, that area where you've got the greatest fire risk, so that area around your building envelope, other areas around your hay sheds, all of those sorts of things. The concept that in your planning of your grazing, you'll go, all right, at this time of year, I'm going to cover crop there, because if I put in a summer cover crop, and I irrigate it, it's going to be nice and green, and it's going to be in that yard area that I've got for my stock store emergency outlet, and it's right next to the yards, and that's all cool because I can actually even use it in ordinary times, maybe as a nice little finishing area. There's all of those sorts of things that you can do as part of your grazing plan, in sort of saying, all right, well, I'm going to do this here, I'm going to do that there, because I've got this note that I'm looking at paddocks needing special attention. Fire is something that we need to pay attention to. Now, if there is a fire, that's when we're going to look at a replan of our grazing plan to assess our stocking rates as we have, and look at the options. It might be that it's a destocking situation that we're looking at, because we have a property which is entirely made up of winter active annual grasses, for example. Well, what are we going to do there? Go and buy feed? See how long your bank balance goes there until you ride that out. If you have your fire, say in November or December, you might be waiting till you get anything growing until June some years. So yeah, there's some of the options that you're going to have to consider. How much forage you have. Did I have a total burnout? In which case, all of my feed's gone, everything's gone. I mean, you're going to have to make some hard choices there, and destocking might be one of them. Following that, in the recovery, we spent a lot of time talking about this in 2016 when I was over there doing the after the fire programs, was what do we do in terms of recovering those landscapes? And that's where we start to look at some really rudimentary steps, where we're looking at using non-inversion tillage, using the various Australian non-inversion tillage machines, yeoman's ploughs, agri-ploughs, Gesners, etc. Getting into mixed species cover crops, which are undersown with the perennials that you probably don't have, that you probably should have, especially if you did have them and they were killed too. So that could be an opportunity to do some of that. Bale graze, silage graze areas of high vulnerability or that can't be deep ripped and effectively sown. Maintain livestock help with mineral and nutritional supplements. If you start feeding hay, it's possible that the nutrition that's from that material may not be there, and they don't have a feed otherwise to bring that up. So it's important to keep the supplements up. And then if you've got a lot of debris lying around, well, it may be because often it will come that you'll have rain after a fire, after a fire season, and that makes the landscape vulnerable to erosion. That can be helped a lot by non-inversion tillage, but it can also be helped by cleaning up some of the material that's laying on the ground, all of the burnt out vegetation, logs, etc., especially the smaller stuff, and pushing that into berms and brush piles just to and give. Once you do that concentration, and that provides some of the fauna that's had a hard time have a bit of habitat as well. So I did this bit of ploughing. This is in Tomales Bay in Northern California, and did this in 2009. And it was because the farmer rang me up and said, "I've just got an order from the EPA that my contractor who spread all of my dairy effluent did it to such a thickness and degree. They're the swashes there. That's just pure effluent from the dairy. He's gone down, washed down into the valley, and it's triggered some of the water quality monitors in the bay, in Tomales Bay, and the oyster fisheries there, which are worth a lot more than economically than the dairy farmers are." So this guy was going to get slapped an order. So we went up there with a plough and ploughed it all, and the wolves were off him, because as an action of doing that cultivation, it meant that we got immediate 100% infiltration, whereas before it was all running off, and we did it in that pattern. So that's just an illustration of how, in the case of if this is all ash, and we've got a lot of mobility of ash and other forms of debris, we want to keep that all there. We don't want to lose anything, right? That ash should stay exactly where it was burnt from, and use the plough so that when it does rain, or these ploughs so that when it does rain, all of it infiltrates and it doesn't run off. These are really effective implements from that perspective. And then follow that with, if we have the capacity, and I know Andy Gulliver's on the call there. Thank you, Andy, because years ago when I was there, one of his representatives was directed by Andy to open up this availability of all this compost that Andy had from his Seawise company, which is amazing. And, we don't often have that access, but if we do, it'd be great to go and put the compost out, to just throw the lot at it. And the compost rates, you can put out relatively small amounts, and it just kickstarts the ecological processes that we want to see happen. And add to that then some seeds, take the opportunity that you've now got to get some seed out. And whatever it is, if you can't get the world's greatest cover crop mix, don't worry about it. Even if it's just wheat, feed wheat, whatever it is, some oats, whatever it is that you can get out and get, so that as soon as the rain comes, that you've got some of the vegetation which is going to leap you forward and get things going. So oats are a really good one. They're usually cheap, usually very available, and so on. All right, nearly there. Economy. Generally, general times, as we've talked about, it's important to have financial planning and to manage your accounts properly so that you manage your cash flow, to maintain capital and cash reserves, maintain your insurance packages so that it's in sync with your risk profile. I mean, a lot of us would be hearing now about the terrible situation with the people in New South Wales and Queensland who, because they're on designated floodplains, cannot afford to get the insurance, so they will lose everything, right? That's not a situation we want to be in, and it's something that we would have to look at very seriously. We don't want to be, especially when our governments are so close to the edge as it is, the amount of debt the Australian national government and governments like ours in Victoria, I don't know about in Western Australia, but the amount of debt, that sovereign debt that we have now, back that up for them to go and be able to prop up people who haven't got insurance and all the rest of it in disaster payments, etc. I don't know how we're going to be able to sustain those levels of cover, of sovereign cover. Anyway, be aware of what's there. check out what covers are available, be clear on what the disclosure agreements are, and have this as part of a conversation with people. I think that this sort of stuff is as important in a land care discussion as vegetation management, because ultimately, if you don't have land carers, then you don't have land care. So it's really important to have these conversations and see what trends there are emerging. Now, after a fire, that's when we look at a replan of the holistic financial planning, and that's largely in concert with your grazing plan, because your grazing plan is ostensibly your operating system for your farm in ideal terms. So that's where we go from there. So in terms of the checklist for energy, this is where we assume that all mains power is going to have an outage, and that power lines are going to be out if they're above ground. But we are probably going to be getting back to just having gen sets or generators, and possibly, if we've got independent power supplies, off the batteries there, if we're lucky, if it's all well set up. I know Dan Tarasenko, who's one of our members in the workplace, he got burnt out at the end of 2019, and all of his power, U-Butte power system, all got wiped out in a bushfire there, which took out the rest of his place apart from his house. So, and that was his outbuildings, and he done everything right. He didn't have a lot of the things that we talk about, but he decluttered and all of that sort of thing. But he didn't have some of the features that we've discussed, and of course that led to that shed that housed all of his power equipment getting taken out, about $40,000 worth or something. Getting protected fuel-rated fuel tanks. Often it happens that a lot of these supplies start to become either, and this is an era that we're entering anyway. I'm having a lot of conversations with people who are saying, as we pay 200 cents a litre almost for fuel in some places, that maybe I should start stockpiling fuel. What's that going to look like? All right, well, if I'm going to stockpile fuel, what does that go into? And if I'm in a fire-prone area, I may as well put the investment. It's about $2,000 to $3,000, if I recall, to buy a fire-rated tank that can store fuel, as well as just store fuel, right? So there's those sorts of things. And then after the fire, or after a fire, take the opportunity to look at how am I going to extend photosynthesis for as long as possible. And I didn't get to the rest of that because I got to 12:29 and I couldn't finish off my sentence. But it was going to say assess all the energy systems that you do have in place to see where they're at. And that'll probably be part of A, your turning back on, and B, your insurance claims anyway. So there's that. That's an example of a fire Fest tank from Queensland, one of their fireproof fuel tanks. All right, so if we look at task work with this whole discussion, this program, this is not something you have to do now, but just in general, and this is the way we framed the RECs more recently as well, because we know that people aren't at school and we're not chasing them up for their homework on each of their different layers. So, but I would say that if you are looking at this, then go through those checklists that I had put in the presentation and any others that are out there that are relevant to you, and in the relevant section of the handbook. Analyze the risks and your own capabilities. I don't have much to say more than that, because that's really what it's about. And maybe to add to that, analyze the opportunities that there are. After the fire, one of the things that we talked about in 2016 at the program there was, a lot of people took the fire that burnt out the place as an opportunity to reconfigure that place, because we're much less likely to do a reconfiguration of a landscape with assets that are in perfectly good order. But if that's all gone, then that gives you an opportunity to perhaps rethink and reorganize the way that your landscape collaborates with all of its different operations and requirements and outcomes. And then the Google Earth, start planning the infrastructure layers that will support your fire protection strategy. And that's part of our whole REX program anyway. All right. So thanks to Kim and Jane and the Peel Harvey team for all their support. I know we've got another session next week, and I'll be talking with you and Kim about what that's going to look like. I think it'll probably look like we're going to catch up with you and see some of your homework and really dive into some of your particular concerns. So I want you to really spend some time thinking about that and bringing to the table some of your scenarios in an activated Q&A, in a very active Q&A. Also to the other NRMs who've supported this program, because there's a number of those in their offices, and the West Australian Government, and David Holmgren, just to thank him as well, because he's been awfully generous in letting me use his copyrighted materials and so on. So, and been a great support and mentor with me over the journey. So, and a Western Australian from Fremantle. All right, well, I'm just going to close that section of the Zoom